The Fisherman's Second Chance. The salt spray of the Galilean wind had been Simon Peter's oldest friend. He knew the bite of its chill on a pre-dawn watch, the taste of it on his lips after a rough storm, the way it carried the scent of nets and fish. His hands, calloused and strong, knew the weight of a full catch, the slick struggle of a thrashing fish, the methodical rhythm of mending torn nets. He was a fisherman through and through, defined by the sea. Then came the Nazarene, Jesus. And suddenly, Peter was no longer just Simon. He was Peter, the rock, the man who would build. He had left his nets, his boats, his livelihood to follow a teacher whose words were like fire and whose presence was like a calm in any storm. Peter, boisterous, impulsive, fiercely loyal Peter, had declared with all the passion of his heart, "Even if all others fall away, I will never deny you." He meant it. With every fiber of his being, he meant it. But the night in the courtyard of the high priest was a darkness Peter had never known, far colder and more terrifying than any storm on Galilee. The master, bound and broken, led away to what could only be death. The accusations, the fear, the sudden overwhelming realization of his own weakness. 3 times the question came, each one a hammer blow to his soul. "You were with him, weren't you?" And 3 times, the words, hot with shame and fear, tumbled from his lips, "I do not know the man." The crow of the rooster, shrill and mocking, pierced the pre-dawn gloom, slicing through Peter's soul. Then, a glance. Across the courtyard, through the flickering torchlight and the chaos, Jesus turned. His eyes met Peter's. There was no condemnation, no anger, only a profound, knowing sorrow. In that gaze, Peter saw not only his failure, but the depth of the love he had betrayed. The world shattered. Peter fled into the night, the sound of that rooster echoing in his ears, a relentless, torturous accusation. He wept. Not the bitter tears of anger, but the searing, hopeless tears of a man utterly broken, convinced he had lost everything, utterly unworthy of the name Rock. The days that followed were a blur of grief and guilt. The crucifixion, the burial, the harrowing uncertainty. Peter clung to the other disciples, a shadow of his former self, his boisterousness replaced by a leaden silence. Even the news of the empty tomb, the sightings of the risen Christ, brought him only a fragile, trembling hope, perpetually overshadowed by the rooster's crow. He knew Jesus was alive, but how could he, the denier, ever face him again? One morning, driven by an ache deep in his bones, Peter returned to his oldest comfort, the sea. "I'm going fishing," he announced to the others. It was more than just a statement, it was a desperate attempt to reclaim the only identity he felt still belonged to him. The others, sensing his unspoken despair, joined him. All night they toiled, just as they had done years ago. But the nets came up empty, again and again. The sea, once his solace, now seemed to mock his emptiness. As dawn began to paint the eastern sky in soft hues, they saw a figure standing on the shore, silhouetted against the rising sun. "Friends, haven't you any fish?" a voice called out across the water. "No," they replied, defeated. "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some," the voice suggested. Skeptical, yet weary enough to try anything, they cast the net. Immediately, it was so heavy they could barely haul it in. John, the beloved disciple, was the first to realize. "It is the Lord," he gasped. At that, Peter, without a moment's hesitation, plunged into the cold water. He swam to shore, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He barely noticed the chill, barely noticed the drag of his wet clothes. His eyes were fixed on the figure by the fire, Jesus. On the beach, a small charcoal fire crackled, its smoke curling upwards. Fish were cooking, and bread lay ready. It was a scene of such simple domestic peace, yet for Peter it held a profound terror. A charcoal fire,
just like the one in the high priest's courtyard. The aroma of cooking fish, like the smells of that terrible night. Jesus looked at them all, his eyes filled with warmth, not judgment. He offered them breakfast. They ate in silence. The miracle of the catch, the resurrection, and Peter's raw, exposed shame hanging in the air. When they had finished, Jesus turned to Peter. He looked at him, not with the condemning gaze Peter deserved, but with the same profound, knowing love from the courtyard, now stripped of sorrow and filled with an irresistible grace. "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Jesus asked, his voice gentle. The question pierced Peter. These? Did he mean the fish, the nets, his old life? Did he mean the other disciples? Peter, who had so boastfully claimed to love Jesus more than anyone else, now found his pride utterly shattered. He could only answer with humble honesty. "Yes, Lord," Peter replied, his voice rough with emotion. "You know that I love you." "Feed my lambs." Again the question came, softer this time. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" The repetition stung. Peter had denied him 3 times. Now 3 times he was being asked to affirm his love. "Yes, Lord," he insisted, a tremor in his voice. "You know that I love you." "Tend my sheep," Jesus commanded. A 3rd time Jesus asked, his voice now imbued with a tender sorrow that broke Peter's heart completely. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved. He had boasted, he had failed, he had denied. He had nothing left but his broken honesty. "Lord," he cried, tears streaming down his face, "you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus, the Good Shepherd, looked at him with eyes that saw his repentant heart, not his past failure. "Feed my sheep." 3 denials, 3 affirmations, 3 commissions. The rooster's crow was finally silenced, replaced by the gentle, firm voice of his master. The charcoal fire, once a symbol of his betrayal, was now a sign of his restoration. Peter was not left to drown in his guilt. He was not abandoned to his brokenness. He was not cast aside for his monumental failure. Instead, Jesus, the shepherd who never leaves any of his children behind, had sought him out, met him in his deepest despair, and given him a second chance. More than a second chance, a complete renewal. Peter, the denier, was not only forgiven, but recommissioned. He was still Peter, the rock, but a rock now forged in the fires of humility and grace, ready at last to truly feed the Master's flock, strengthened by the knowledge that even after the deepest fall, the shepherd's love would always call him back to the light.
The shepherd's burden. The scent of salt and fish on the Galilean shore had given way to the dusk and clamor of Jerusalem, but Peter now carried a different kind of burden. The shame of his denial still lingered, a phantom ache, but it was overshadowed by the fierce, burning zeal for his resurrected master. The threefold affirmation by the charcoal fire had not erased his past, but transformed it into a crucible where humility and grace were forged. He was no longer just Simon. He was Peter, the rock, but a rock now softened by compassion. The early days of the nascent church were a whirlwind. The outpouring of the Holy Spirit on Pentecost had ignited a fire in Peter's soul, replacing his impulsiveness with a spirit-filled boldness. He preached with an authority that astonished those who remembered his recent denial. Thousands were added to their number, and Peter, true to his commission, began to feed Jesus' lambs with fervor. Yet the burden of leadership was heavier than he had ever imagined. The young church, burgeoning with new believers from diverse backgrounds, was far more complex than a fishing boat. Disputes arose, arguments over food distribution to widows, questions about who truly belonged, debates over the law. Peter, the man who once denied his Lord out of fear, now found himself constantly navigating internal conflicts, his courage often tested not by Roman soldiers, but by the very people he was called to serve.
One particularly intense day, a heated argument erupted in a crowded house where the disciples met. It concerned a dispute between Jewish and Gentile believers, a deep-seated tension about customs and purity that threatened to tear the fragile community apart. Peter listened, his heart heavy, seeing the same kind of divisions and blindness that Jesus had often pointed out among the people. His old, impulsive self wanted to shout, to command, to force a solution. But the new Peter, forged by failure and grace, held his tongue, waiting, praying for wisdom. As the voices grew louder and the divisions seemed irreparable, Peter remembered the charcoal fire. He remembered Jesus' gaze, filled with love and not judgment. He remembered the simple, profound command, "Feed my sheep." He understood then that feeding the sheep wasn't just about preaching grand sermons. It was about gentle, patient, self-sacrificing love. It was about seeing past the arguments to the broken hearts beneath. He stood up, his presence commanding silence. His voice, usually booming, was soft, imbued with a deep authority born of experience. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his gaze sweeping over the arguing faces. "We wrestle not with the law, but with love. We were all once lost. We were all once outsiders. I myself claimed I did not know the Master. 3 times I denied him. But he did not deny me. He sought me out. He met me by a fire, and he restored me, not because of my perfection, but because of his perfect love." He paused, letting his personal testimony hang in the air. If the Master could restore me, a denier, and command me to feed his sheep, how can we, his flock, now turn away any whom he has called? How can we allow old customs to blind us to new grace? The shepherd's fold is wide enough for all.
His words pierced through the anger and legalism. Many remembered his public denial, his profound repentance, his visible transformation. His vulnerability, his shared brokenness disarmed them in a way no stern decree could. They saw in him not just a leader, but a living example of the very grace he preached. Slowly, the tension in the room began to dissipate. The arguing ceased, replaced by murmurs of agreement and, eventually, a spirit of reconciliation. Peter didn't offer an easy answer or a perfect solution. He offered himself, his own story, as a testament to the boundless compassion of Christ. He guided them not by wielding power, but by embodying humility. That day, Peter truly began to understand the depth of his commission. It wasn't just about leading, it was about loving, tirelessly, patiently, even when the sheep were stubborn, even when they seemed to wander into new forms of spiritual blindness. It was about recognizing that the shepherd's burden was also his greatest joy, to never give up on any of his children and to teach his flock to never give up on each other. The scars of his past, once a source of shame, had become the very wellspring of his compassionate leadership. For only one who knew the pain of being lost could truly appreciate the relentless love of the shepherd, who always calls them home. The unbreakable rock. The years deepened the lines on Peter's face, etched there not just by the sun and sea, but by the weight of leadership and the joy of seeing Jesus' flock thrive. He had become the rock Jesus had envisioned, not because of his own strength, but because he was continually grounded in the grace that had restored him. The early church, once a fragile sapling, now sent roots deep into the soil of many lands, and Peter was a tireless gardener. But the world outside grew increasingly hostile. The Roman Empire, once largely indifferent, began to view this burgeoning way as a dangerous cult. Persecutions erupted, sometimes violent and brutal. Leaders were arrested, believers were scattered, and the threat of martyrdom became a daily reality. Peter found himself on the run,
moving from city to city, strengthening the scattered flocks. He preached in secret gatherings, comforted the fearful, and discipled new leaders. The dangers were immense, the pressure constant. Many times, as Roman patrols passed by or angry mobs threatened, the old instinctive fear would resurface, a cold whisper reminding him of that fateful night in the courtyard. You denied him once, you could deny him again. But each time that fear arose, Peter would close his eyes and remember the charcoal fire. He remembered the penetrating, loving gaze of Jesus, the 3 questions, the 3 commissions. He remembered that it was not his own strength that sustained him, but the relentless, unwavering love of the shepherd who had called him back. His past failure, once a source of paralyzing shame, was now a constant reminder of the depths of God's grace, making him humble yet utterly fearless for the sake of the gospel.
One day, while ministering in the city of Rome, the heart of the very empire that sought to crush the faith, Peter was finally apprehended. He knew his time had come. The news spread quickly among the terrified Christian community. Many urged him to flee, to hide, to deny his identity as a follower of Christ one last time. An old friend, Barnabas, visited him in the prison cell, his face streaked with tears. "Peter," he pleaded, "they will kill you. They will make an example of you. Escape while you still can." Peter smiled, a peace radiating from him that astonished Barnabas. "Barnabas," he said, his voice calm, "do you remember that night, so many years ago when the rooster crowed? I denied him, Barnabas, 3 times. I let my fear win. But he did not leave me there. He came to me by a fire on the shore, and he asked me if I loved him. 3 times he asked." Peter paused, his gaze distant, as if seeing that beach once more. "And 3 times I said yes, and 3 times he told me to feed his sheep. How can I, who have been shown such boundless mercy, now deny my shepherd when his sheep need my final testimony?" He looked at Barnabas, his eyes clear and full of an unwavering light. "My death, Barnabas, will not be a defeat. It will be the final yes to his love. It will be the ultimate feeding of his sheep. It will show them that his grace is stronger than any fear, stronger than any empire, stronger than death itself." Peter was led to his execution, but even in that moment, he refused to allow his death to overshadow the glory of his master. When the guards prepared to crucify him, Peter made one final, humble request: to be crucified upside down. "I am not worthy," he declared, his voice strong even in the face of death, "to die in the same manner as my Lord."
His last act was an act of profound humility, a final, public testimony to the Christ he had once denied. As he hung there, inverted, his eyes looked not to the ground, but symbolically to the heavens he would soon enter. His life, marked by the deepest failure, ended in the most profound act of faithfulness, a monument to the relentless grace that had pursued him. The execution of Peter, far from crushing the church, galvanized it. His final, humble request became a powerful symbol of discipleship. His story, told and retold, became a cornerstone of faith. The impulsive fisherman who fell, who denied, but who was loved beyond measure, restored completely, and empowered to become the unbreakable rock, a shepherd whose life and death testified to the unwavering heart of the Master. The shepherd, Jesus, truly left no child behind. He found Peter in his despair, turned his shame into a testimony, and used his brokenness to build a foundation that would withstand all the storms of history. And in every generation, whenever a follower stumbles, whenever a cry of failure echoes, the gentle voice of the Master, "Do you love me?" still calls, offering a second chance, a renewed purpose, and the strength to feed his sheep until the very end. The enduring legacy of Peter reminds us that even our greatest failures can become the most powerful witnesses to his limitless grace.
The echo of the rooster. Centuries folded over the hills of Galilee and the cobbled streets of Rome, burying the physical footprints of Peter. Yet his spirit, like the enduring cry of the rooster, continued to echo through the corridors of time. The church Peter helped build grew vast, stretching its branches across continents. But with growth came new challenges, new persecutions, and new forms of denial. In the midst of the Dark Ages, a monastic community high in the remote mountains of Britannia stood as a beacon of learning and faith against a backdrop of encroaching paganism and brutal invasions. Among them was a young, brilliant, but deeply insecure monk named Brother Thomas. He was a gifted scribe, his hands nimble with quill and ink, painstakingly copying ancient scriptures and commentaries. He reverenced Peter, seeing him as the unbreakable rock, the foundation. But in his own heart, Thomas wrestled with a profound sense of inadequacy. He was not a bold missionary, braving savage lands. He was not a charismatic preacher, swaying crowds. He was just a scribe, timid and prone to self-doubt. The monastic life, though seemingly safe, was not without its trials. Raids from seafaring invaders were a constant threat, and whispers of apostasy, of other monks abandoning their vows under duress, filled the cold stone halls. One bitter winter, a particularly fierce band of raiders, known for their cruelty, descended upon the region. News reached the monastery that they were systematically destroying holy sites and forcing conversions back to pagan gods. The abbot, an old and wise man, gathered the monks. "Brothers," he said, his voice trembling but firm, "our lives may be demanded of us. We must be prepared to stand for Christ, even unto death."
Fear, cold and sharp, gripped Brother Thomas. He imagined the raiders' brutal faces, their terrifying weapons. His hand, so steady with a quill, now shook uncontrollably. He pictured himself, weak and trembling, asked to deny his faith, just as Peter had been. He heard the phantom crow of the rooster in his mind, a terrifying premonition of his own potential failure. He felt utterly incapable, a fraud in the shadow of Peter's glorious martyrdom. That night, alone in the scriptorium, the flickering candle illuminating the words of Peter's epistles, Thomas wrestled with his soul. He read of Peter's admonition to be alert and of sober mind so that you may pray, and the promise that, after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. But how could he be strong? How could he be steadfast? He saw the illumination of a passage describing Peter's denial. His nimble fingers traced the familiar words, "I do not know the man," and then Peter's desperate weeping. A profound realization struck Thomas. Peter was not a perfect, unyielding rock from the start. He was a broken man, a fearful man, a denying man. And yet Jesus had called him back. Jesus had restored him. Jesus had not left him in his failure. This was the true strength of Peter, not his initial boast, but his ultimate humility and dependence on Christ's grace. His courage came after his failure, forged in the crucible of forgiveness. The next morning, the raiders' scouts were spotted on the distant hills. Panic rippled through the monastery. Thomas, however, felt a strange, quiet calm settle over him. He found the abbot and spoke, his voice clear despite a slight tremor. "Abbot," he said, "I am not Peter, the great apostle. I am only Thomas, a fearful scribe. But I will not deny my Lord. If they demand my life, I will give it. And if they demand a denial, I will remember Peter's tears, and I will remember the charcoal fire, and I will say yes to my master, for he has never denied me."
He was not promising perfection, but a willingness to stand, relying not on his own strength, but on the same grace that had restored Peter. He walked to the monastery gates, not to fight, but to meet whatever came with a quiet, prepared heart. The raiders eventually swept through, But by a miraculous turn of events, they were distracted by a more lucrative target, sparing the monastery from full destruction, though some relics were stolen and a few monks were harmed. In the aftermath, Brother Thomas, once a timid scribe, emerged as a quiet leader. His fellow monks had seen his initial fear and then his unwavering resolve. They heard his testimony, not of personal strength, but of the strength found in Peter's story, in the shepherd's ceaseless grace. Thomas's legacy was not one of grand battles, but of steadfast faith in a time of darkness. He taught that even in moments of profound weakness, the echo of the rooster could be a call to remember Christ's forgiveness, and that every child, no matter their fear or their past failures, was cherished by the shepherd who always calls them back, never leaving them to be lost in the shadows of their own doubt. His life, inspired by Peter's second chance, became a testament that the unbreakable rock was not just a man, but the relentless, restoring love of Jesus, which continued to strengthen even the weakest among his flock across all ages.